Many of you use or work around chemicals every day. They contribute to advances in technology. Many of them fuel our economy. But chemicals have to be handled with care. Using a chemical incorrectly, storing it in the wrong conditions, or even just mislabeling a chemical could lead to a serious incident. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, developed the Hazard Communication Standard to make sure incidents don't happen in your workplace. OSHA's HAZCOM standard is now enhanced with elements of GHS, the globally harmonized system of classification and labeling of chemicals. The goal of GHS is to have countries around the world classify chemical hazards the same way and communicate this information in a standardized format. With GHS elements now added to OSHA's HAZCOM standard, you'll see an increase in the quality of the hazard information you get on the job, especially in organizations that do business internationally or receive hazardous chemicals from a foreign company. The enhanced HAZCOM standard should reduce confusion about chemical hazards, which should also reduce injuries and death. Any organization that manufactures, handles, or uses chemicals must follow OSHA's HAZCOM standard and maintain a written hazard communication program at their site, which is available for you to reference at any time. There are crucial elements in the revised HAZCOM standard that you need to understand. These include the classes of chemical hazards, the items required on chemical labels, and the sections that must be included on safety data sheets. We'll also cover how you can access your employer's written hazard communication program. Understanding OSHA's revised HAZCOM standard isn't just about complying with regulations. When you label chemicals correctly, handle them properly, and know how to access important information on safety data sheets, you show your supervisor and coworkers that you take your job seriously and know how to do your job well. So let's get started. Manufacturers and importers must use a thorough method to determine the hazards of chemicals they produce or import. Under the HAZCOM standard, these hazards are divided into 6 categories. A physical hazard relates to the physical or chemical properties of a substance. Examples of physical hazards include being explosive, flammable, or corrosive to metal. A good example of a chemical that's a physical hazard would be paint thinner. A chemical is classified as a health hazard if it could cause a health effect, such as skin irritation, eye damage, or breathing problems. An example of a chemical in this category is sulfuric acid, found in battery acid, which can cause burns to the skin and eyes and other dangerous health effects. A chemical that falls under the simple asphyxiant hazard class is a substance or mixture that displaces oxygen in the atmosphere. This means that people exposed to the substance are deprived of oxygen and can become unconscious or even die. An example of a chemical in this hazard class is nitrogen in a confined space. Combustible dust is a solid material that is finely divided into particles that can catch fire or explode if ignited in air. Examples include aluminum metal dust, coal dust, and even flour. In fact, any combustible material can become explosive when in a finely divided form. A pyrophoric hazard is a gas that will spontaneously ignite in air at or below 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Silane is one example, which is used as a water repellent and in solar panel manufacturing. The last class of hazard is called hazards not otherwise classified, or HNOC. A chemical that falls into this class poses an adverse physical or health effect that does not meet the criteria of the physical hazard or health hazard classes we just discussed. Generally, the chemical either falls below the cutoff value or concentration limit of these other hazard classes. Labels communicate vital information about a chemical. They tell you what the chemical is, its hazards, and how to protect yourself when handling the chemical. Here are the items manufacturers and importers of chemicals must include on their products' labels. The product identifier tells what's in the container or package. It provides a unique way for the user to identify the product. The name should match the name used on the safety data sheet. Labels must provide the name, address, and phone number of the manufacturer, importer, or other responsible person. A signal word, either danger or warning, quickly tells you how severe the chemical's hazard is. Danger is for more severe hazards, warning for less severe. A hazard statement is a short phrase that describes the nature of the hazards of the product. For example, you might see statements such as highly flammable liquid and vapor and may cause liver and kidney damage. Precautionary statements briefly and concisely explain recommended measures for safe handling, storage, and disposal. They may also indicate how to handle an incident involving the product. Examples of precautionary statements are keep container tightly closed, do not breathe vapors, and wear protective gloves. Pictograms are also required on hazardous chemical labels. A pictogram is a visual symbol that quickly alerts workers to the hazards they may be exposed to. The pictogram used is determined by the hazard classification of the chemical. Let's briefly review the 9 pictograms. The health hazard pictogram applies to chemicals with one of these characteristics: carcinogen, mutagenicity, reproductive toxicity, respiratory sensitizer, target organ toxicity, or aspiration toxicity. The flame pictogram applies to chemicals with one of these characteristics: flammable, pyrophoric, self-heating, emits flammable gas, self-reactive, or organic peroxide. The exclamation mark pictogram applies to chemicals with one of these characteristics: irritant, skin sensitizer, acute toxicity, narcotic effects, respiratory tract irritant, or hazardous to the ozone layer. The gas cylinder pictogram applies to gases under pressure. The corrosion pictogram applies to chemicals that may corrode or burn the skin, cause eye damage, or are corrosive to metals. The exploding bomb pictogram applies to chemicals that are explosive, self-reactive, or are organic peroxides. The flame over circle pictogram is used for chemicals that are oxidizers. The environment pictogram, which is not mandatory, applies to chemicals having aquatic toxicity. The skull and crossbones pictogram applies to chemicals that have acute toxicity, meaning that they're poisonous even from a one-time exposure or from multiple exposures in a short period of time, usually 24 hours or less. It's very important that you're familiar with these pictograms so you can easily recognize the hazards of the chemicals you work with. You can see that labels on chemical containers tell you important information. When chemicals are shipped to your workplace, you need to make sure that labels are in good shape and they stay that way. If you notice a damaged label, report it to your supervisor so it can be corrected immediately. One of the major changes to the HAZCOM standard was replacing the Material Safety Data Sheet, MSDS, with the Safety Data Sheet, or SDS. Safety data sheets have 16 sections and they must be organized in a standardized format. Chemical manufacturers, distributors, or importers are required to provide SDSs. Employers are required to make them readily available to their workers. But you are responsible for reading them and following the recommended safe work practices to protect yourself and your coworkers. Let's briefly cover the 16 sections of the SDS. Section 1, Identification, includes the product identifier, the manufacturer or distributor name, their address and telephone number, an emergency telephone number, recommended use, and restrictions on use. Section 2, Hazard Identification, covers all the hazards of the chemical and the required label elements. Section 3 is Composition and Information on Ingredients. It provides information about the chemical's ingredients, including trade secret claims. Section 4 describes first aid measures in case of exposure to the material. Section 5, Firefighting Measures, outlines extinguishing techniques, equipment, and any chemical hazards from fire. Section 6 is Accidental Release Measures. This section describes emergency procedures, protective equipment, and how to contain and clean up the product if spilled or released. Section 7, Handling and Storage, identifies precautions for safely handling and storing the chemical product, including any incompatibilities. Section 8 describes exposure controls and personal protection. It includes the permissible exposure limit, threshold limit values, as well as recommended engineering controls and personal protective equipment required. Section 9 lists a product's physical and chemical properties, such as appearance, odor, flash point, evaporation rate, and flammability, just to name a few. Section 10, Stability and Reactivity, indicates the product's stability, possibility of hazardous reactions, conditions to avoid, incompatible materials, and hazardous decomposition products. Section 11, Toxicological Information, describes the likely routes of exposure, symptoms of exposure, numerical measures of toxicity, and whether or not the product is considered a carcinogen or a potential carcinogen. Sections 12 through 15 describe ecological information, disposal considerations, transport information, and regulatory information. However, Sections 12 through 15 are not regulated or enforced by OSHA, and therefore they may not appear on all SDSs. Section 16, called Other Information, identifies the date of preparation or last revision of the SDS, and may include any supplemental material the manufacturer or importer chooses to provide. SDSs for all of the chemicals used, handled, or stored in your workplace should be easily accessible. Electronic access to SDSs is allowed, as long as there's nothing that would prevent you from accessing them when needed, such as a power outage. In addition to the SDSs, a list of chemicals used in your work area should be maintained and available to you for your reference. Chemicals make our lives better in many ways, but they can also threaten our lives if they aren't treated with caution. In this program, we discussed how OSHA's HAZCOM standard has been enhanced with elements of GHS and how aligning with GHS will help countries communicate the hazards of chemicals in a safer, more standardized way. We covered the 6 classes of chemical hazards to help you understand the ways chemicals can cause harm. We also discussed the elements required on labels. When you can quickly understand what is being communicated on a label, you can prevent injuries and death. We also reviewed the safety data sheet. SDSs give you the information you need to work with and around chemicals safely. If you ever have questions about how to handle a chemical, consult the SDS or your supervisor immediately. OSHA's HAZCOM standard exists to protect you. Your employer follows the standard to make sure you and your coworkers go home safe every day. Do your part by being alert to labels, following guidelines for using and handling chemicals, and asking questions if you're ever unsure. Guessing how to handle a hazardous chemical could be the last thing you do.